This week's parsha opens up with Avram Avinu sitting. He's healing from his bris milah, his circumcision, which he just had in last week's parsha, at the age of 99, self-administered circumcision. And he's sitting, healing, in a lot of pain. And then the Torah tells us that Hashem showed up to visit him, right? Because there is a mitzvah of bikor cholim, visiting those who are unwell, spending time with those who are unwell. And Hashem was fulfilling this mitzvah. The Medrash says that Hashem fulfills all the mitzvahs that he instructs us to fulfill. And then as Avram Avinu is sitting, chatting with Hashem, he sees these three people in the distance approaching, and he says to Hashem, do you mind to just hang on a second? There are some people coming, I want to go take care of them. Okay, interesting story. And there's obviously a lot to talk about here, a lot to unpack, a lot to discuss and to investigate. Now, just remembering for context the background of Avram Avinu, who he was. Avram Avinu was someone who, it says about Avram Avinu that the divine attribute of chesed, of kindness and generosity, got upset when Avram Avinu was born, came into the world, and started doing his thing, because this divine attribute of kindness and generosity turns to Hashem and says, I'm redundant. You don't need me anymore. You've got an entity, a person, a vehicle in the world that is effectively endless kindness and generosity. I'm out of a job. This was Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu was the epitome of kindness and generosity. Avram Avinu lived in the middle of the desert. He was wealthy, he had a lot of resources. He had this enormous tent that had openings on every side, so that no matter what direction someone was coming from, they would see, yes, this place is open, it's a place that I can approach. And he would offer people food, he would offer people drink, a place to rest, and anyone, regardless of who they were, where they were coming from, where they were going to, was welcome to come and eat and drink and rest in Avram's tent. This was Avram's thing. Almost his identity was kindness, generosity, giving. So for Avram Avinu, understandably, he sees people in the desert approaching him. He's going to have a very, very strong instinct and urge to get up and go and greet them. So he's sitting and having this conversation with Hashem. Hashem is coming to visit him as a person who's healing, and he says to Hashem, do you mind? Just hold on a second. Al no savar. He says, please don't pass on. I have to get up and go take care of these people. Do you mind just to wait a minute? Please hold. So the Gemara says that we learn from this. There's a conversation in the Gemara that talks about hachnosas orchim. Hachnosas orchim, literally hachnosas means bringing in of orchim, guests, bringing guests into one's home, entertaining guests, taking care of people, hosting. Hosting is probably the right word. And there's a conversation about, first it says that the hosting guests is as great as being in the Beis HaMidrash, as learning Torah. It's greater than study Torah. And eventually the Gemara, is going through this series of suggestions, and then the Gemara lands on and says, hosting guests is greater than Kabbalas Pnei Shechina, than receiving the face of the Shechina. If we look at the root of the word, shachein, to rest. Shechina is Hashem's, or dwelling. Hashem's dwelling presence. This is the presence of Hashem that can be present in the world, that can dwell here. And hosting guests is even greater than literally sitting face to face and receiving and hosting Hashem's dwelling presence. And the Gemara brings a source as evidence to back up this suggestion, and that is this story of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was sitting and being Mekabel Pnei Shechina. Avraham Avinu was sitting and talking to Hashem. And in the middle of this conversation, he says, Hashem, do you mind to hang on a minute? Please, hang on, don't leave. I'll be back. I've got to go take care of these people. Clearly, assuming that this was not a mistake that Avram made, and it wasn't, there's no indication anywhere of the fact that this wasn't the right thing to do, that means that hosting guests is even of greater value and merit and meaning than hosting Hashem. There's a very interesting alternative version of this teaching. So that's what it says in the Gemara. And then Rambam, in teaching us this halacha, the halachas of hachnosas orchim, of hosting guests, he says that, he tells us the story of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu got up and left Hashem to go and host guests, which teaches us, and this is the path that Avraham Avinu forged for us, which is that hosting guests is even greater than hosting Hashem. This is very, very unusual, because Rambam writes this in his Sefer Mishneh Torah, Yad HaChazaka, which is it's a book of laws. It's a rule book. Right? The whole reason that Rambam wrote this book in the first place, and he says it very clearly in the introduction, he says that I am undertaking this project, and it was we take it so for granted today, but this project that the Rambam embarked on in writing this set of, it's a lot, it's a big set, because Rambam understood that, if you want to know what to do before Rambam, if you were alive pre-Rambam, and you wanted to know, okay, what does Torah say I should do in this circumstance, what are you going to do? You're going to go look it up in the Gemara. That was the best we had. Good luck finding something in Gemara, even if you know it's a halacha about Shabbos. Well, first of all, the Gemara on Shabbos is enormous. Second of all, the nature of Gemara is that it's a recording of conversation and debate, and things go from one to the next to the next. And you might find something mentioned on one topic in a completely different tractate of Gemara that's officially a completely different subject, but that might be the place where you find that ruling because it's a record of conversations. And the nature of conversations is that they're dynamic and they can jump around. So if you wanted to know what to do and you didn't already know and you wanted to look it up, unless you already had an extraordinary familiarity with the whole Talmud to the fact that maybe you don't remember exactly what it said, but at least you remembered where to look. Just to know where to look requires extraordinary mastery of Gemara. And the reality is that that level of mastery of Gemara is something that the overwhelming majority of people are simply not realistically going to achieve. Which means that most people, if they don't already know what they're supposed to do in a situation, they're stuck. Well, what are they going to do? It's like literally the equivalent of a needle in a haystack, maybe worse. So, maybe like a haystack the size of a city, that you could look through the Gemara the rest of your life looking for something and maybe not find it. So Rambam undertook this task recognizing that he had achieved something that most people have not, and realistically, effectively, let's say more or less cannot, considering the reality of their lives and how much, first of all, not everyone has the intellectual capacity that Rambam had. Not everybody's life is set up in a way that they can afford to dedicate enough time on an ongoing basis to achieve that level of mastery of Gemara. And so Rambam set out to extract all the conclusive statements at the end of the conversations in the Gemara. When the Gemara, after 5 pages of debate back and forth and distractions and hopping back and forth, now I use the word distraction loosely, obviously it's not a distraction, but a conversations that seem to be hopping around, and then there's a ruling, a definitive ruling at the end, Rambam takes those rulings and all the ramifications and the rulings that are maybe not explicit in the Gemara but are implied or understood, etc. He took all the rulings, all the halachos, all the laws that are relevant to all the mitzvahs that we have to know and organized them systematically. So he has 14 books. Each book is, let's say, a theme, a somewhat broader theme, and then each book, each theme is subdivided into specific topics of halacha, and then within each topic there are chapters and halachas. In a particular, within a given chapter, certainly within a set of halachas, Rambam might be quoting things from across the spectrum of Gemara, of the Talmud. But the whole point of this book is to be concise and clear. So there's not really, in general, there's not conversation, there's no back and forth. Rambam isn't generally... Rambam might at times quote just a phrase from a verse, a few words, but Rambam doesn't generally tell us stories where we learn things from. This is not what Rambam does. This is a book of halacha, and the whole point of it is, the more concise, the better. Because the whole point of this was to make things clear, concise, without anything that's not practically relevant. Because everything that's not relevant to a person practically needing to know what to do is just going to make it more complicated for the person who needs to find the answer to find it. So we don't want anything that is not a part of this is what you do. The whole point of it was to separate the conversation and the background and the reasons from the decisive rulings, the conclusions. So why over here is Rambam giving us this story of where it comes from? And he tells us this whole, it's beautiful. This is the path that Avraham Avinu forged for us, that hosting guests is greater than hosting Hashem. This seems very out of place in a book whose primary purpose and objective is to eliminate everything that's not a decisive ruling so that there's no confusion and it's as simple and clear as possible to find what you need. But Rambam does do that. He gives us the story. Why? Now, there is an alternative statement to this one, which Rambam quotes from that Gemara, which says that hosting guests is greater than hosting Hashem's dwelling presence. In Tikkunei Zohar it says, and this is the source, the origin of this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it says that hosting guests is as great as hosting Hashem. Which is very similar, but there is a very clear, specific difference. And that difference is that the Gemara and Rambam so if we have, let's say on one side, hosting guests. On this side we have, let's call it hosting Hashem. / Shechina. Rambam and in the Gemara say that hosting guests is greater than hosting Hashem. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says it is equal to. They're not the same thing. Both of them are substantial. Both of them are a very big deal. And perhaps, let's be real. You know what? I'm going to say, I'll be real. For me, personally, is there any real distinction in my life and my experience as to whether it is equal to hosting Hashem or greater than hosting Hashem? Now, practically, perhaps there are ramifications, so that's important. But, I mean, these are both a pretty big deal. But they do choose to express it differently. They are not the same statement. The question is why? And is there a connection between the difference between these two statements, perhaps, and the fact that Rambam is giving us this whole background of Avraham Avinu, and this is the path that Avraham Avinu forged for us, etc. So a big part of this is going to have to do with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the life, the identity, who Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is, let's say, trying to look for the right word, the emotionally correct word. I don't really have one, but he's, let's say, the grandfather of Kabbalah, as it is today. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai interestingly, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai actually he has this very fascinating, I mean, we could talk about this for a long time. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is quoted in every single chapter of Mishnayos or Gemara, at a minimum referenced in every single chapter. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai very often just says Rabbi Shimon. When it says Rabbi Shimon, that is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So he's not, like some person who was steeped in mysticism and Kabbalah, but, you can have people who have a niche. It's not like his niche was mysticism and Kabbalah, and like halakha and the practical stuff, that was for someone else. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is quoted in every single chapter of Mishnah and Gemara. Quoted or at least referenced explicitly. He's also, let's say, the grandfather of Kabbalah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai spent over a decade in a cave because he had to run away. His life was at risk. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's experience of the spiritual, of divinity, was categorically different to that of the regular person. We can naturally, a human being, we have 5 senses with which we can receive input information, right? Which are sight, hearing, feeling, touch, taste, smell. We can see, hear, taste, feel, and smell physical things. Anything that's not physical, we have no way to touch it. We can't see it. Not because it's invisible, but because it's not physical. It doesn't physically exist. It doesn't reflect light. We can't smell it. What happens when we smell? When you smell something, the ability to smell something depends on some of that thing that you're smelling entering into your nose, which is how you smell it, right? When you smell something, that's why a lot of times when something gets warm, when you're cooking, as things warm up, the aroma gets much stronger, right? You could have something that you take it out of the fridge and it's uncovered on the counter and you barely smell it. You put it on the stove for a couple of minutes, and the second someone walks in the door, they're like, oh my goodness, that smell. Why? Because as it warms up, more of it evaporates, there's more of it in the air, and as it's in the air, it can make its way into our nose. So you can't smell something that's not physical. It doesn't have molecules that can make its way into the olfactory nerve endings inside our nose. There's no way to smell it. Same thing with touch. Same thing with taste and, did I say them all? Whatever. Hearing, yeah. right? What is hearing when we hear? What happens? We have eardrums inside of our ears. That's a membrane, and there are waves movement that travel, and they enter into our ears and they hit the eardrum. The eardrum vibrates. It's connected to nerves that detect the vibrations and send them to the brain, and the brain puts together this experience of sound based on those vibrations. Something that's not physical can't create physical vibrations. You can't hear it. Now, what we can do, so technically, based on that, it should be impossible for us to have any perception or experience or relationship with anything that doesn't physically exist. How can you have a relationship or even a perception of something that you can't see, hear, taste, feel, or smell? And the answer is, the question's solid. I would say that the alternative route that is available is using our minds. We can learn about something. Now, learning about something is a starting point. Learning about spirituality, learning about Hashem is like buying ingredients. You can buy all the ingredients in the world, but if you don't get into the kitchen and put them together and create a food out of those ingredients, all you're going to have is a bunch of ingredients. You're not going to have anything to eat. There will be nothing to put in your mouth. I mean, depending on what kind of ingredients you buy, but we have to acquire ingredients with which we will then be able to cook, and then we have to actually make something out of the ingredients. Learning about spirituality is the acquisition of the material. Then the work we do with that material is to, because it's just information, is to connect to, first of all, it's taking the information and putting it together into a picture. So there's a narrative here. There's an actual entity, there's a perspective, there's a story. And then the work is to connect to it, to integrate it, to internalize it, so that it starts to affect our experience. It can affect the way we feel. All of us have the opportunity, the ability to do that. And I would say that all of us have a responsibility to ourselves to engage in that work of learning, understanding as much as we can about spirituality, about divinity, about the Creator, and then putting in the work of trying to connect, to internalize, to integrate, to make it real for ourselves, to make it something that's not just information in our head, but it starts to affect who we are and the way we perceive the world, the way we perceive ourselves, etc. Question?
You use the word acquisition, like to search?
No. Acquisition means to get, to acquire something.
But it's like in Christianity.
In what context?
Like Inquisition, it's like...
No, that's inquisition. Acquisition, to acquire something. Yeah, you recognize acquire?
Yeah.
So when you acquire something, that is an acquisition.
Right. Because I got confused with renown changing.
Yeah. No. We don't do inquisitions.
So if learning about Hashem is like buying the ingredients, and is the baking the cake taking that information and forming a relationship with it, and the actual cake how we interact with the world moving forward?
I would say, I would probably put it a little differently. I would say that the baking of the cake or the cooking of the dish is the integrating. It's the work of and the process of connecting, of internalizing, of bringing it down from here in our heads and our minds into our bodies and our hearts. And then the relationship with Hashem is like eating the food. We can't have a relationship with something that doesn't exist to our body and to our heart. Not a real relationship, anyways, a fulfilling and meaningful one. Make sense? Now, I would say that there are two things that are true here at the same time. The first one is, and really they belonged in the opposite order, but there are two things true at this point as well inside of this first thing, which is that not on one hand, it is true that this is a big job. It requires a lot of learning, but much more importantly, when we talk about it being a big job, the work of internalizing it, of integrating it, of making it real, of making it something that's real in our bodies and in our hearts, not just in our minds. I mean, it's a lifetime of work. It's a never-ending process. And it takes very, very real effort. You know, people, it's easy to severely underestimate how much effort this kind of work takes. And just to put this very tangibly, I don't remember where I saw this, but I saw once that people who compete, at the level of international championships in chess, can burn 7,000 calories in a day playing chess, sitting down in a chair.
Wow.
Now, I mean, you could have maybe a bodybuilder who has an insane basal metabolic rate because of their body and their metabolism, and they can maybe burn their way through 4,000 calories a day just sitting down also. But usually chess grandmasters don't look like, Ronnie Coleman or Chris Bumstead. They're just regular average people, regular average bodies. Where did those 7,000 calories is like triple what a regular, healthy, active adult male will consume in the course of a day being a regular active person, not lying in bed. It's triple that. Where did that go? And the answer is their brains are working at like maximum capacity, non-stop, and they can burn through, just the mental activity of playing chess can burn through another 5,000 calories on top of what they'd regularly be burning. Maybe less because they're sitting in a chair the whole day. It's not even like they're walking around, going shopping, whatever it is. They're sitting in a chair, playing chess the whole day, and the mental activity that they're putting in burns 5,000 calories. It's almost impossible to burn your way through 5,000 calories in a day with physical activity, realistically. I mean, it's not technically impossible, but no normal person is doing that, ever. Even a person who exercises a lot is not burning their way through 5,000 calories with exercise, ever. But you can do that playing chess the whole day, right? So that's just to make it clear that when we say this work is real and it takes real effort, it's not just like, it's not some rosy, beautiful thing we're saying to say like, oh yeah, it's also work, don't worry, it's real effort. It's like, no, you can measure the calories. Effort, internal effort, a person who's sitting in a chair and barely moving, but doing internal work inside their mind, inside their body, inside their nervous system, their brain, can burn thousands of calories in a day with that work. It's real and can end up physically exhausted. It's very real work. It takes very real effort. Just sitting down and trying to focus, to connect with ourselves inside. Just entering into that state of connection can be very hard work. And then being there and then moving around whatever it is that's inside of us in that state of connection to self and inquiring, investigating, and then working with that can be absolutely exhausting. It's very real effort. It burns a lot of calories. It's real. So it's very real work. It's very real effort. Now, a tangent that comes out here, that just sort of showed up, I would say, that's very relevant to this, is that a lot of times people want to, let's say, do the work, and then they find themselves not doing it and not doing it and not doing it again, and can feel disillusioned, discouraged, etc., when really often what they need is to just realize how hard it is to do, and to respect the effort that it takes, respect how difficult it is, and to understand that this is not something you're just going to do on the side. This is very real work. You have to make time. You have to create time to do it. You have to create some sort of space, an experiential space, a physical space. It's very, for most people probably having support in the process can be very helpful, possibly a necessity, at least at first. And so when we understand how difficult it is, it can actually be very helpful to bring clarity as to why maybe someone who's been trying to get themselves to do it hasn't been doing it, or has been kind of doing it but struggling. It's like it makes sense for it to be a struggle. It's very, very hard work. And again, not just figuratively, in the amount of calories that it burns, it's very real. Now, this work that we do, it takes time to integrate ideas that we have no physical senses, no physical tools to receive, to interact with, to see, to hear, to feel, to touch, to smell, to feel, to taste, to smell. To take something that's absolutely abstract, that doesn't physically exist, and take information about it and integrate it and internalize it to the point that that information is here in our body and in our heart and not just in our mind, it's a process, and it takes time, and it takes a lot of work. And the fact is, there's a very real limit to the extent to which the extent of what we can achieve. At the end of the day, someone puts a spoon of ice cream on your tongue, you're always going to taste it. And we can do work and do the work successfully and be putting in the effort and work on our appreciation for spirituality and godliness, etc., and make tremendous progress. The reality is it is an uphill battle. And I don't say that to discourage. I think it can be encouraging when we understand that, like, it's okay. If it feels like an uphill battle, that's because it is. And it's okay for it to be an uphill battle. That's the lay of the land. It's exactly what it's supposed to be like. And we are never going to feel a physical, we are never going to experience godliness in a tangible way, the way that we experience the flavor of a delicious food, or the aroma of something that smells beautiful, or the touch of something that feels amazing. We just won't. That being said, it's also true, and I'm what I'm about to say now, when I say it's also true, just to be clear, I'm not saying that it says this in a book. I'm saying that I personally I believe this very strongly, that if we can muster up the courage and the effort to do the work, and particularly to be doing it on a consistent basis, to create some space in time on a regular basis, and some space in physical space and experiential space, a space that is dedicated to learning and then to connecting and integrating and internalizing what we know about Hashem. And the truth is, it's not only that space that we create to do, let's say, the obvious part of the work is a big part of it, but a big part of it is also the little things throughout the day, all day, every day, little that that's, let's say, maybe the engine room, that space is the engine room, but then there's work to do all the time. If we can muster up the courage to be in that work on a regular, consistent, ongoing basis, on one hand, yeah, there's a cap. There is a cap to, it's never going to taste like ice cream, physically. That being said, the progress that we can make, that every one of us can make, in a very real way, I am very confident that what we can realistically achieve, if we can get to that place where we're putting in the work, is most likely far beyond what most, if not all of us, think is realistic to achieve. Maybe that's because there's not so much evidence of it, because it takes a lot of work, and it's hard. I'll leave it at that. But the potential is there, and it's very real. That being said, right, there is a limit for most of us. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a whole different ballgame. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the grandfather of Kabbalah because he spent more than a decade in a cave doing nothing but this work of connecting to Hashem, of internalizing, of connecting to Hashem with his mind, and then bringing that connection down into his body, into his heart, into all of him. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the experience of spirituality and divinity for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was completely different to what it is for your regular person, for any of us, for anyone else. And in two ways. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai took this, and it was the realest thing for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. For Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, divinity, godliness was the most real thing. Which means that for him, in a somatosensory way, in a physical way, in his body, that was the most prominent part of his experience, was the experience of divinity. Now, practically speaking, what are we here for? Yes, it's important to shift our focus away from the material to become less materialistic and to be more focused on spirituality, divinity, godliness. But that does not mean that we are supposed to neglect or ignore the material, the physical, the world around us, our own bodies, the needs of our own bodies. Absolutely not. If that was the case, Hashem would have just created our souls and never bothered with the bodies and never bothered with this whole world, because none of that is necessary for godliness. The whole point of us existing and of the world existing is for us to not be materialistic, but to be involved with the material in a way that's practical and responsible and healthy, so that the divinity that we are focusing on and attaching to and connecting to, etc., can be channeled through our lives and interactions with the world and our body into the world and into our bodies. That's the whole point. Where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was different to everyone else was that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai could channel via a spiritual experience into his body and into the world around him. That was the exception. The rule is that we channel into the world and through our bodies, and therefore into our bodies as well, through action, through physical interaction with the world. That's the way it works. We interact with the world in the way that we're supposed to. We are channeling divinity into the world by interacting with it. We are channeling divinity into our bodies by using our bodies to act, to move, to think, to talk. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the exception. So for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, doing something interactive in the world wasn't necessarily superior to having a spiritual interaction with Hashem, because he was able to channel out into the world through a spiritual experience. So for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, hosting guests is equal to hosting Hashem, because he was able to impact the world through a spiritual experience. But that was the exception. That was extremely unique. That was just Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And this is why Rambam tells us that this is the path that Avraham Avinu forged. Avraham Avinu wasn't just a private person. Avraham Avinu was the OG patriarch of the Jewish people. That was his life, that was his purpose. Everything that Avraham Avinu did was forging a path. And so in forging a path for us, for his descendants, Avraham Avinu, as much as, having a conversation with Hashem sounds like a pretty nice experience to me. But Avraham Avinu, this, even if Avraham Avinu would have experienced things the same way that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai didn't have the same status of original patriarch of the entire Jewish people that Avraham did. Avraham Avinu's everything about his life was forging the path, making things possible for us, clearing the way. And so Avraham Avinu, in clearing the way for us, for him, actually hosting physical people, human beings, which these guests happen to not be in the end, but that's a detail on the side that let's say he wasn't aware of yet. That comes first. Having a spiritual experience and interaction with Hashem is amazing and beautiful and all the rest of it, and divine and sacred and everything. It is all of those things. But at the end of the day, if there's an opportunity to host guest people, to influence the physical, real-world experience of another person, to behave and act in the world physically, and to channel divinity of Hashem into the world, it's a higher priority. Even if Avraham Avinu would have preferred to continue the conversation with Hashem rather than hosting the guests. At the end of the day, the objective is bringing the divinity and bringing the godliness, that Shekhinah that he's hanging out with, that he's hosting, into the world. And to channel Shekhinah, divinity, godliness into the world requires interacting with the world. And so yes, hosting the guests is superior to hosting Hashem. Hosting Hashem is amazing and beautiful, but that's not achieving Hashem's primary interest to the same extent that hosting guests is achieving Hashem's primary interest. So if the reason you want to host Hashem is because you care about Hashem and you love Hashem, then you will want to achieve what is most important to Him, which is in the body, in the world. Bringing the divinity down through and into our bodies, and then through our bodies into the world by interacting. So for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he says, yes, they're equal. Because he had that unique to him, that ability to channel divinity all the way into his body and out into the world through spiritual experiences. But for us, for everyone else, it has to be physical experiences, a physical connection with our bodies and physical interactions with the world. And Avraham Avinu was the patriarch of the Jewish people, forging the path for us. And that's why Rambam goes through this whole thing. And this is the path that Avraham Avinu forged for us. That's why even if there is such a thing as an experience, as a life in which they are equal, that's beautiful. But that's not us, that's not our experience, and that's not what we're here for. That's why he says, this is the path that Avraham Avinu forged for us. That hosting a guest is even greater than hosting the Shekhinah itself.
I have a question.
No, you have a question? Can't be.
Yeah, because your English is my goal, your vocabulary, but I need to clarify that I understood everything correct. So, when Avraham Avinu was 99, because of the Brit Milah he accomplished, he received these 5 senses, right?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so through the spiritual procedure, he received these physical abilities to cooperate with this world. So basically, we have these 5 senses in order to serve Hashem physically, but doing mitzvahs which are spiritual.
Well, mitzvahs are not spiritual. Mitzvahs are physical actions that have a spiritual content. That's the whole beauty of mitzvahs, that we're physically interacting with the world and channeling the spirituality through those physical actions.
Yeah. So some people they have lack of any. They don't have.
So on that note, I just want to say, whoever, if anyone wants to get up and go have a drink or stretch your legs or whatever before the next class, please do.
No one goes. Okay, Mama, some pressure. So some people they don't have, for example, ability to hear or something. So do we connect it somehow with a spiritual problem, channel? If it's all connected,
I would say that an inability to hear, let's say if someone's deaf, very frankly, it's possible that that might be primarily a physical body issue. It's possible that there might be a soul issue. Now, a soul issue doesn't mean that their soul is inferior, it just means that the soul components associated with enlivening and empowering the ears and the ability to hear might be not functioning correctly, the same way that the physical ear could not function correctly. It could be both. Now, invariably, that will come with the same way that physically, right? If a person is deaf, their other senses will be heightened, right? As an adaptation to overcome that deficit, their other senses will be more sensitive and more perceptive than average. Spiritually, and in terms of a person's purpose and mission. Now, first of all, there are so many parts to this, but if a person is, let's say, deaf or blind or whatever it is, that means that that person was put here to achieve something very special and unique and specific that requires the person, the way that they showed up in the world, as the vessel and the messenger to achieve that unique thing in the world. So it's not an indication of any sort of spiritual deficit at all. It's an indication of a specific, unique journey and purpose. Spiritually, also, there are going to be other things that, let's say, approximately are going to be there to compensate and etc. The same way that physically there are always other things that adapt to compensate. So ultimately, there is definitely a lot of spiritual meaning to, let's say, someone having a deficit in one or more of the 5 senses. But I wouldn't look at it as a spiritual deficit. That's definitely not the right way of looking at it.
I have one more question.
Okay?
People on the higher spiritual levels, meaning tzaddikim and hidden tzaddikim, people who has higher connection with Hashem, could they somehow run their senses, be a little bit adopt them, or understand?
Yeah, there are stories of tzaddikim who, in a sense, what we might say colloquially disabled themselves partially, disabled hearing in one ear because there was something that they didn't want to hear, and they were just like, "Oh, turn that off." But that's not common. That being said, what I would say is that I think for most people, probably all, but I could say with a high degree of confidence, most people for sure, there is so much room for growth in terms of becoming in touch with, present in our bodies and in touch with all the different parts of who we are as a human being. And then the ability to work with those things and for things to be so more rich and complex and beautiful, and to find ways to use those things fully to serve Hashem rather than them just being in the background. And to use them selectively, but we can't be selective about how we use something if we're not even in touch with it and we barely even know that it exists. And certainly have never experienced it or been in touch with it at all. So I would say that we all do have the room to do a lot of a similar sort of thing.